with us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Kubiak. I'm a professor of practice at ASU, where I serve as the director of future security education in ASU's Future Security Initiative. The educational offerings I help guide include the MA in Global Security, the MAGS, which has a non-technical concentration in cybersecurity and a brand new concentration in irregular warfare. We also offer our graduate certificate in global security and competitive statecraft and are building a new portfolio of short courses in similar topics to be offered through ASU's Career and Professional Development Education Outlet, Career Catalyst. Today's event is one in a series of events that we host each fall and spring semesters to highlight the thought-leading security practitioner faculty that teach in our programs. Today, we're fortunate enough to have the co-directors and founders of the Future Security Initiative, Professors Daniel Rothenberg and Peter Bergen. Professor Rothenberg is a professor of practice and a co-director of the Future Security Initiative. He's a senior fellow at New America and author-editor of With These Hands, Memory of Silence, Drone Wars, Understanding New Proxy Wars, etc. He's a prolific writer and is an outstanding spokesman and a thought leader. He was one of the principal architects of the innovative MA in Global Security and plays a central leadership role in the development of future FSI research and educational outreach efforts. Professor Bergen, also a professor of practice here at ASU, is the other co-director of the FSI. He's vice president and director of future security at New America. He's a security analyst for CNN and an award-winning journalist and author, having produced multiple best-selling books, including The Cost of Chaos, The Trump Administration and the World, and The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden, the biography. His latest project is a brilliant podcast that I strongly recommend you listen to because I find it very, very interesting, called In the Room, and it's on Audible if you want to check that out. I'd like to start the event real quickly with a short discussion about what the Future Security Initiative is, what it's been up to, and where it's going. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it off to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, the Future Security Initiative, we launched in the fall of 2023. So we've just finished our first calendar year of FSI, Future Security Initiative operations. We're just putting out our annual report for 2024, so those on the email list will get that pretty soon. And I'll just give you a little overview because we've been very excited about the things we've done. It's a partnership between ASU and New America, a DC-based think tank. So many people in our team are dual-hatted, including Jeff, including myself, and of course, Peter, who's vice president of New America. So we, FSI faculty and fellows have brought in, or our PIs, directors and co-directors on $28.5 million in new grants and various research and educational projects. We grew quite a bit in 2024. We added 15 new team members, 4 faculty, and 11 fellows of various kinds. We've had 6 books published by our team in 2024, over 100 articles and book chapters and white papers, various awards. Our colleagues Ken Gleman and Amos Fox, new faculty, brought in, actually Ken the year before and Amos this year, helped ASU launch or bring the Small Wars Journal to our university. It's now available through our through an ASU run website, and that's doing quite well. The MA in Global Security that Jeff mentioned has a record number of students and a record number of graduates. Up 11% from the previous year, and we organized 57 public events in 2024, including the 10th annual Future Security Forum. So in a previous iteration, as the Center on the Future of War, we began running this annual national conference, and this past year was our 10th iteration of it, and we're just thrilled that you're with us today. We're happy to welcome you to all of our events, and thank you all so much.
Okay, great. I think what we're going to do now is have a conversation with Peter and Daniel about the security challenges facing the incoming administration that arrives in the White House on Monday. Peter, I know you've written volumes already on the previous Trump administration, so I want your reaction to this question that I just read a headline as I'm eating my lunch. It says, Donald Trump will upend 80 years of American foreign policy. That seems like a pretty big statement. How do you take that? What do you take that to mean? And what's the validity of a comment like that?
Well, thanks for organizing this, Jeff. If I was John Bolton, which I'm not, I would respond in the following way. John Bolton, of course, was Trump's third national security advisor, and he's confident. He's certainly said to me in the past and also elsewhere that Trump wants to pull the United States out of NATO. Well, that would upend 80 years of American foreign policy. Congress has tried to Trump-proof that kind of approach. So to pull out of NATO now, you need a supermajority in the Senate or both houses voting for it. And I think there are plenty of Republicans who would not vote, even though obviously there's a 2-vote difference in the House and a 3 or 4 votes difference in the Senate. I don't think it would be possible by legislation to pull out of NATO, even with Trump's very strong control of the Republican Party. However, that said, Trump can undercut the premise of NATO by saying things similar to what he said in the past. So, for instance, who cares what happens to, in some obscure Baltic country if the Russians are sort of, either creating, subversion or sabotage or possibly even some kind of incursion. Because if the commander-in-chief of the most powerful member state of the alliance is publicly undercutting it, then the Article 5 element of the alliance, the collective right to self-defense, is undercut. So he can certainly undercut it. Now, will he do that? The Washington Post reported, and the Kremlin denied, and I tend to believe the Post more than the Kremlin, that during the transition, Trump had a conversation with Putin in which he was quite strong on Ukraine, saying, you've got to sort of, so, the only thing predictable about Trump is he's kind of unpredictable. And so, yes, he has said lots of things to undercut NATO in the past, but it would be hard from a legislative point of view to pull out of NATO. He might continue to make these kind of statements undercutting NATO. He might, on the other hand, he said, that he could get peace in Ukraine within 24 hours. Zelensky understands that even if you do the thought experiment where Kamala Harris had won, the appetite to send large-scale aid to Ukraine has disappeared in the United States, and any aid that is going to be framed as loans. And that was true, I think, in a Democratic administration as much as a Republican one. So, we'll see what he does on Ukraine. Zelensky's obviously trying to come up with Plan B. European countries are spending more; they're sending more to Ukraine. Everybody's been sort of Trump-proofing their foreign policy. But to get back to the question about, that headline might be somewhat hyperbolic. There are other reasons. I mean, I'm just focusing on NATO, but there's some other questions that are worth considering. But I don't want to monopolize the time.
Well, I think that while we're on the topic of Europe, though, and Ukraine for that matter, it struck me that I read something the other day about it was either Walz or Rubio who started walking back the simplicity of the solving the Ukraine crisis. So, do you get a sense that during the campaign, President-elect Trump made some comment, but he hasn't made any comments since. Like I said, his mouthpieces are saying something different now.
Well, the more you know about something, the more complex the less you know about it, the simpler it seems to fix. And the more you know about it, the less simple it seems to fix. And so, Mike Waltz is a former New America fellow who, he's a very good choice as national security advisor. I'm sure he understands that it's complex. And so similar with Senator Rubio. Keith Kellogg, who was Vice President Pence's national security advisor, is close to Trump. Basically, they enjoy playing cards together. Kellogg is a retired 3-star who actually came up with a very cartoonish plan for peace in Ukraine that is described in Bob Woodward's most recent book. But, I think the bottom line is, if Trump prides himself on being a deal maker, Stalin said quantity has a quality of its own. We're seeing that with the Russians. I mean, they're throwing everybody into the breach that they can without having conscription, and they have mass that is just gradually grinding down the Ukrainians. And on the other, the Ukrainians, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is 40, which is an astonishing number. And it has been very unpopular to lower the conscription age in Ukraine from 27 to 25. It has happened, but when you've got 40 million people in one country and 140 million people in another country, and the Russian economy is doing somewhat well, despite the sanctions, because there's a Keynesian war spending effect. On the other hand, the fact that we've got North Korean troops in fighting alongside the Russians does indicate perhaps the supply of manpower is not infinite unless you go to conscription, which Putin doesn't want to do. So, the kind of classic definition of when people make peace is by Zartman, since we're in an academic context here, which is the mutual recognition of a hurting stalemate. And this is a hurting stalemate and has been for quite some period of time, with the advantage to the Russians. But, what are the people's red lines? Obviously, there's no way that you can have agreement where Putin gives up Crimea. There's no way you can get an agreement if Ukraine is allowed in any shape or form to join NATO. And it's interesting, the Ukrainians are not talking about territory anymore. They're talking about security guarantees, because I think they understand that there's some but by the way, the territory is now totally destroyed in eastern Ukraine. There's not, it's not like there's some. So what are those security guarantees is the main question. Is it like our security guarantees with Japan? Our security guarantees with South Korea? If it's not NATO, is it a major non-NATO ally? I don't know, but the Ukrainians clearly are very focused on the question of what kind of guarantees they might get.
Sure. You mentioned, let's shift topics just a little bit. You mentioned that Trump fancies himself and sees himself as a deal maker. I found it interesting that in the announcement about the ceasefire in Israel and between Israel and Hamas, President Netanyahu actually made a comment that he was thanking both President Biden and President-elect Trump for their support in generating this, the terms of this, or helping generate the terms of the agreement. I was wondering if either one or both of you had comments on kind of how that shaped up and what role President Trump played there. Is this a coincidence that this is occurring on the cusp of the inauguration?
Well, it's a fact that Matthew Miller yesterday, announcing the agreement, who's the spokesman of the State Department, credited the Trump team with making this work. Now, would it have worked without Trump? We can't tell, because it's a counterfactual. But the Logan Act would presumably, which has never been successfully, it's been around for a long time, but people haven't been prosecuted. President Trump has been acting like he's president from the moment he got elected. And remember the whole kerfuffle around Mike Flynn talking to the Russian ambassador when he was national security the last time around. That was partly the idea that you can't be an incoming administration and be negotiating as if you are part of the actual administration. But clearly the Biden team was enthusiastic about having the Trump team on board, and clearly there's been a good result. And so. I mean,
isn't it interesting? I mean, here's a major ceasefire, where both the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration can take credit, and that it's got to be true that it has something to do with the incoming Trump administration, but then it's also pretty much the same ceasefire as the Biden administration proposed in May 2024.
It is, so the other thing, this is a question for you, Daniel, which is so. My friends who understand Israel better than I do say this is a lot to do about the particular state of play in Israeli politics right now, which was Netanyahu felt he could, the finance minister and the other minister have always kind of been blocking this. He felt that he had the support to kind of ignore the fact that they were blocking this. I don't know if that's true or not, but there's something about Israeli domestic politics right now that was also. Obviously, it's an Israeli domestic political decision, ultimately, not an American decision.
Sure. I mean, this is what the U.S. administration was pushing for some time, right?
Yeah.
we
But I
don't
must,
know how this is gonna create tensions potentially from the Israeli right and the new Trump administration. It's not what the right wing has been pretty clear about. There's all the hostage. The system involves, a sort of graduated return of 33 hostages in stage one, and then the full return doesn't happen in stage two. Stage one is a temporary ceasefire. Stage two is a permanent ceasefire. There's many things that can go wrong and shift and adjust. It also involves, the release of a fairly large, we expect, number of Palestinians detained by Israel, including some for life sentences and have committed serious crimes. It's not what the right wing in Israel said was their what they wanted. So.
Yeah, you mentioned several things could go wrong before, and it seems they already have, right? Because not, just announced there will be no vote in the cabinet until Hamas, meets the requirements. So I think that's right. I mean, it's one of those complex situations that it's going to take 20 consecutive miracles in any case to make something like this happen. Not that it can happen, it's going to be difficult. Let's stick around with Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah in some fashion, and talk about Israel and Iran, because that seems to have submerged a little bit in the discourse on security in the Middle East, at least at this moment, by comparison to other topics. Is there something still brewing under? I mean, clearly, I won't insult myself here with asking this question. But what's the state of play there, and who are the next movers, and what's the next move? Do we have any idea what that might be?
I think
I
Israel
mean,
has shown that it can penetrate Iran's defenses more or less at will. What Israel does not have a capacity to do is to take out Iran's nuclear program. It's buried too deep. You're an Air Force guy, Jeff. The kinds of bombs that you would need to kind of blow up the key nodes of the Iranian nuclear program, the United States has, but Israel doesn't have.
Right.
But on the other hand, the Iranians know that Israel can operate more or less at will in Iran, other than against their nuclear program. They've lost their land bridge to Hezbollah because Syria is now
Sure.
in
Mhm.
hands of Sunni militants, at one time allied with Al Qaeda. Their responses against Israel in April and October, where they unleashed, unprecedented barrage of missiles and drones, were ineffectual. I mean, they didn't kill a single person, even though there was a lot of them. That was obviously Iron Dome, but also a lot of US help and UK help, and also help from Saudi and Jordan and other countries that didn't necessarily provide, firepower to kind of bring down these missiles, but were helped in terms of, information about where the missiles were coming, et cetera, et cetera. So
Mhm.
from Iran's perspective, they're not doing well at all. Their economy is in free fall. They know that Trump is coming in with a maximum pressure campaign. And they've been under huge. One thing worth pointing out here is the United States has sanctioned the Iranian regime for the past half century with no change in Iranian actual policy of any substance. The only time that actually worked was in 2015 when they did come to the negotiating table to get sanctions relief for the Iranian nuclear deal. They're out of that deal now. Now they have enough fissile material for several nuclear weapons. Tony Blinken has publicly said they're a week or two away from a nuclear weapon, which is a pretty astonishing failure, given the fact that when they were inside the nuclear deal, they were a year away from being
Here.
able to enrich to a weapons grade material. So, on the one hand, they have this nuclear weapon capability, which they probably don't want to go turn the final screw on because it puts a huge target on their backs. On the other hand, they're not doing particularly well, in terms of their proxies, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah. The Houthis are still doing well, and they seem undeterred. And one other wrinkle here, which is interesting, is Iran and Saudi Arabia are closer than they've been in the past. I mean, obviously they were
Mhm.
sworn enemies, but the
Right.
Chinese have taken a role in sort of trying to broker some kind of cold peace, which is another factor here.
To go
Interesting.
to Peter's point, though, one of the most extraordinary things that happened in 2024 is, as Peter mentioned, there were two instances when this one state sent over ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones twice. Typically, if you were to have put out a fact scenario and say one state is going to shoot missiles at another state, that would be the start of a war. And amazingly, in both cases, they were all taken down, and like Peter mentioned, not only by Israel, not Israel acting alone, but a whole coalition of different actors, the U.S., UK, and others, from the air, from different bases. But it's a kind of a, it's a fascinating illustration of a certain kind of war and a certain kind of response. When at the same time, we look across the border and you look at Syria, and there's no Assad regime now. And that didn't happen because of massive technological capacity. It happened sort of, in the classic way of an insurgent movement with relatively minor military capabilities in the big sense, and took
Yeah.
down a regime, ending a 13 years of war.
I think isn't it kind of a fact though that Assad only survived the previous onslaught of civil war
Yeah.
unrest, if you will, a few years ago, based upon Russian support and Russian resolve to keep their puppet in place in Damascus. And now with that basically being strained by their own war in Ukraine, they don't have the resources to support a two-front war, if you will, one in Syria and one in Ukraine. Is a lack of Russian support what allowed for the Assad regime to fall?
Yes, and also
And Hezbollah,
lack of Lebanese Hezbollah, who
Lebanese
were
support.
the shock troops.
Oh, got you. Right.
So, because
Good.
Iran had supported Assad from the beginning of more or
Yeah.
less the beginning of the civil war. Then Russia ended the war in 2015 with air power in particular, which was very helpful. And so,
Right.
yeah, in the absence of these two countries, Assad was vulnerable.
So given that, and given the fact that even if just geographically Syria plays an important role, what's the U.S. what's the next administration's approach to the Middle East reference to Syria? How would you see that playing out?
One interesting question is, what will the Trump administration do with regarding the Syrian Defense Forces? So the Kurdish
Mm.
forces allied closely with the U.S. in the anti-ISIS campaign, who control territory in northeastern Syria. So they've lost key cities, Manbij and other areas, and Turks are pushing down from the north. But to the degree the U.S. retains its troops there and is willing to support the SDF, that ensures their ability to stay in control. But to the degree they don't, that might be it for that group. And it's not clear if the Trump administration previously pulled back, if you can remember, a few years ago, from supporting SDF. Now we don't really know.
Right.
There haven't been statements about it, and of course the government, isn't in power yet.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, Trump has
Good.
gone back and forth about. I mean, at one point there were 900 American troops
Yeah.
in Syria. Now, in fact, it's been revealed there are 2,000, which is not a huge number, but it's not nothing. And Trump went back and forth about whether to pull those troops out,
Yeah.
and was generally persuaded that that they were worth keeping there. A, because they were in the area of Syria which has oil, and B, as an anti-ISIS force, and C, sort of as an anti-Iranian sort of force. But on Syria, I mean, I'm sure they're like the rest of the world in sort of a wait and see mode, because is Jelani the leader of the HTS, which runs Syria now? Has he changed his views, or is he just saying what he needs to say to sort of get the international kind of countries to accede to the fact that he's the ruler? Is it, and that's still a bit of an open question. But that said, so far they've done very little to behave as if they're jihadists with very Sunni militant views. They allowed Christians are an important minority in Syria. Christians celebrated Christmas unmolested, which is not something ISIS would have ever done. So far, it appears, and they are interested in governance, and they haven't got rid of all of Assad's bureaucrats. They didn't make the same mistake the United States made in Iraq, which was getting rid of all of the sort of Ba'athist bureaucrats. So we'll see.
Yeah. Okay, I want to make a mention. I saw a hand go up from a colleague of ours, but let's use the question and answer block, and I'll moderate the questions and try to get Peter and Daniel to respond to questions you have. So you should have a Q&A block on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Let's use that, and I'll moderate the questions from there. Okay, so before any other points of interest, do you think, before we leave the Middle East, or potentially even North Africa, the Maghreb, or that area, with regards to challenges that are being posed to the current administration?
I mean,
Well,
we haven't talked about Latin America.
Well, I know it's just we got a long ways to go.
Yeah, I mean, everywhere presents challenges of different kinds, right?
Right.
And we don't. I mean, the big takeaway is probably we don't really know what the Trump administration is going to do, and they probably don't know either because things will shift as they actually take on
Yeah.
governance, right?
No, that's true. So prediction is not necessarily what we can do here, but there is, at least in this point, unlike 8 years ago, we have
Yeah.
some history to go upon, right? So, and this is where I'm going to rely on you, Peter, because I think the next question comes down to, and it relates to Central and South America, which is the immigration crisis that really is a function of failing states in that region. And what's the approach there? Are we still going to do the deterrence at the border, or is there a deeper approach that helps address the core of the problem?
well, Venezuela's economy is in free fall. I think their economies have contracted 3 times larger than the U.S. contraction during the Great Depression. So a third of the country is left, a lot of them to Colombia and other neighboring countries, and obviously a lot of them trying to get in the United States. Part of that is United States responsibility because we've sanctioned the regime up the wazoo. The Maduro, regime obviously is kind of a neo-socialist regime with very feckless economic policies. So that's but we have compounded the situation with sanctions that I don't think have been particularly helpful and have immiserated the Venezuelan population. I think it's highly unlikely that Trump would lift those sanctions. And of course, Maduro just took office having, by every international standard, lost the election. But on the border, the Biden administration belatedly really cut sort of. There was more continuity between Trump and Biden on the border than some people recognize. So there was something called Title 42 during COVID, which basically meant that the border was effectively closed. And the Biden administration lifted it, and then there was a huge, massive amount of immigration all at the same time. And I think that, to a large extent, cost Biden the election because it didn't really matter. I mean, I thought it was both brilliant politics and good policy for Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis to send migrants up to Martha's Vineyard and Chicago and other places and New York, because suddenly you had the New York City mayor and the New York governor saying we can't take any more people, and suddenly what had been a border problem and a southern problem was now a national problem. And I think it clearly there was this question of completely unconstrained migration in this country is, it's a problem and it has to be addressed. The question is, what do you do about it? As is well known, Trump sabotaged what was a bipartisan bill that involved Arizona's cinema, and I think it was the Oklahoma senator, quite conservative senator, which would have put a lot more border judges. There are only 650 asylum judges in the country, which is an absurd number.
Right.
And the backlog of these cases is just, it's like years so that I mean, there are some sort of commonsensical approaches that don't involve mass deportations. And what we know from Homan, the kind of point person on the deportation issue, is they will go after criminal, they'll start with people with criminal records, which seems, that doesn't seem unreasonable. But when you start doing the math, there are 1.2 million people in American prisons, and there are 15 million, let's say 15, there's argument about how many non-legal migrants there are. Let's say there are 15 million. So you'd have to have like 15 times the capacity that we already have in prisons if you're going to detain everybody. And at least theoretically, if you're a migrant who's here in the country and we're about to deport you, you're supposed to have a hearing. So think about the number of judges, think about the size of the detention facilities, et cetera. So from a logistical point of view, it's going to be very hard. So my guess is, given those facts, and is that the low-hanging fruit will be what will happen, and then we'll see, because there's probably some. I mean, the Republican Party is also split, which you saw with this debate between Steve Bannon and Elon Musk, which is Musk wants highly talented immigrants to continue working, as do all his tech bro buddies, and Bannon wants total totally stop any migration into the country. So this is a real schism inside the party.
So Daniel, I think you're a much more you're a Central kind of Latin America expert on this. Is there I know where I was listening to Peter's Audible podcast about immigration, which is so interesting to me. And that's where I think the core of the problem still resides in the politics and economies of Latin America in general, but certainly some South American countries. Is there a positive role to be played by the U.S. there? Is the administration in a position to do that in order to help kind of alleviate some of the strain that the immigration problem puts on the borders?
It's interesting. It's always presented as such a problem, but if you go to places in the Americas, it all depends where. So Venezuela is a disaster, right? It's a very special case. Haiti, similarly, is in a very special situation of crisis. But, other countries, say Central American countries, migration's transformed life for people. The migration patterns began, say, from Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, in the wake of devastating political violence in the 1980s. The first migrants were coming through. And look at these countries, they're entirely dependent on migrant remittances. So some number of those folks are now legalized in the US, but a decent number are not, partly because the streams are so steady. But if we take a step back for a second, the lives of people in a lot of migrant sending countries have been transformed in an entirely positive way. Communities have houses they never, people, they're unrecognizable communities of migrant sending communities. It produces all sorts of dislocation, all sorts of complexity and suffering. Key to this is, as the U.S. has created an ever more militarized border, the costs in every sense of the word have gone up for migrants. It used to be relatively easy to cross and relatively inexpensive. Now, there were no cartels interested in managing migration because the profits were so low. Now the whole system's become so much more complicated and so much more costly in every sense, so much more violent. But take a step back, there's no singular narrative to make sense of migration. I mean, the migration patterns are hardwired into our system. We have entire U.S. industries that depend on migrants with complicated legal status, everything from name the legal status, right? Whether they're TPS or whether they're people who have no papers or whether they're dreamers, entire industries rest on undocumented and complexly documented labor. Entire communities do. So it's hard to imagine there's going to be the mass deportations of the type discussed in the campaign. But surely there'll be deportations, and we'll see how they play out. But to get to your question,
Yeah.
there's no way to sort of exactly turn off the mass movement of people in this world. One of the things that's happening around the world is huge demographic shifts. And a piece of that is also that wealthy countries like the US tend to have very low fertility rates overall. And so
Yeah.
what drives the growth of the US by almost every metric is immigrants. Now, it's got to be right that we should have a more rational immigration system. And maybe all of this tension and pressure politically and domestically will produce a serious push for comprehensive immigration reform. That's stalled time and time again. We haven't had serious reform since the 90s, and we haven't had kind of comprehensive reform since 86. But regularizing the status of all of these people and somehow also trying to address what drives them is an incredible challenge. I think it's unfortunate that we've gotten to a stage where the dominant narrative on issues of migration to the US is so negative. I don't think that's accurate,
Right.
and I don't think it's productive, but maybe this is a phase that will shift, particularly with these aggressive policies that will no doubt be implemented by the Trump administration.
Right. And I have been reading a lot more lately too about low birth rates, especially amongst the white population in America, and it's cause for concern for a lot of folks, from economists to demographers of any kind. So there is some concern there. So maybe hopefully, there's at least some glimmer of hope for some
I would
rational
just add one
discussion
thing.
about
So,
immigration.
I grew up on the East
Yeah,
Coast, and the Statue of Liberty story of the U.S. was what I was raised with. This idea that what made the country great was its
yeah,
welcoming of waves of people from other places. My family story, but the story of so many people. And
yeah.
it's a story of the country that I think still resonates. I realize there's lots of pressures and the concerns about the way in which migration is operating is real. The dysfunction of our system is real. But But there is a narrative of the U.S. that is, I think, it's very different than what's dominating right now. I think it still resonates. And quite frankly, it's partly true about the success of our country. If you look around the country at
Oh yeah.
thriving communities, many of them are driven by, or at least supported by, fairly substantial waves of recent immigrants.
Well, Elon Musk's story is not is not baseless either, right? His
Right.
idea of how we've attracted the kinds of talent, the kinds of intellectual talent that we've thrived on over the course of the last whatever
And
80,
people
90
still want
years
to
for
come to
sure.
this country. That isn't true
Yeah,
for everywhere in the world.
right,
You're not true for
Peter.
China.
Right. Right.
Which thank you for the segue, Peter. That was brilliant. But we do have to discuss that, and I think as you probably know, I'm building a course this spring in winning the 21st century Cold War. Clearly, it's a framing of the U.S. and Chinese relationship as something that is a Cold War, whether it's lowercase c, lowercase w, or uppercase c, uppercase w two, right? The second Cold War. Um, do you see President Trump taking the same kind of approach to China as he did in his first term, which was fairly aggressive in terms of a sense of needing to decouple and those sorts of efforts, or more or less try to hold them accountable for unfair trade policies, or where do you see that his policies changing much in the second administration?
I don't, and there wasn't much change with Biden either.
Yeah.
Biden kept the tariffs in place. He actually made it impossible to export to China anything to do with AI or quantum computing that could help their military. He put a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. So he took the Trump policies and he amplified them. And since Mike Waltz is a kind of a China hawk as national security advisor. Marco Rubio is a China hawk, and he's Secretary of State. And clearly, they're going to take a very robust approach to China, which they inaugurated in 2017 with their national security strategy, written by H.R. McMaster or led by H.R. McMaster, which was really the first time that the United States has sort of officially said, China is a rival that we plan to compete with, and we are concerned about. Which was a change in policy because the previous policy had been, basically kind of based on wishful thinking, which is they liberalize politically as they grow economically. In fact, the exact opposite happened, which they grew economically and they got more repressive. So, and then the big question is Xi. Xi has told the People's Liberation. Basically, I think there are three issues that Trump will have to deal with, and China is the big one. But in that bucket, will Taiwan either blockade completely Taiwan? Will China completely blockade Taiwan, or will they invade by 2027? Because CIA believes that Xi has told People's Liberation's Army to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, which would be obviously during Trump's term. Second issue is tariffs. Trump has said a bunch of different things about tariffs. At one point, 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. More recently, 10% on all Chinese goods. Are these negotiating tactics? Who knows? But those tariffs would A, be inflationary, and B, are essentially a tax on American consumers. And then the third issue, I think, which is the extent to which the Chinese have penetrated all U.S. government cyber networks, which is kind of a news story that we've been hearing about recently. So the Taiwan tariffs and the cyber threat, these are all kinds of things that Trump will have to deal with. And on the cyber threat, what do you do? Because American policy, generally speaking, in this area is not to respond in kind, or not to, with some, obviously there was Stuxnet in Iran, and that was an offensive cyber operation. But as far as I can see, the United States doesn't engage in offensive cyber operations as a general kind of principle, and that may well change under Trump.
I think you missed a topic with regards to China that Trump's going to have to deal with, and that's TikTok. And I'm not being silly here because, quite frankly,
I agree.
TikTok, yeah, it's a really important topic. I have a 27-year-old lives with me, and she's telling me the other day, "What's wrong with the Chinese? I don't know. I don't understand why everybody's so upset with the Chinese. And what's TikTok the problem? She gets her news off of TikTok. She gets entertained off of TikTok.
I agree. That's a huge thing I missed. So maybe Elon will
Yeah,
come to the rescue.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, so I wish maybe I'll bring my daughter in here. She can help shape this conversation because I think it's important. It struck me, it literally struck me in the head as I'm building this course on U.S. and China that this generation, she's a Gen Zer, and the Gen Zers, all wrapped up in their TikTok videos, don't see the world the same way that you, I, Donald Trump, Mike Waltz, I mean, the rest of them are going to see the relationship. And if the Trump administration goes pursuing policies that create pain for the American people in terms of inflation, higher costs, missing piece of things off the shelves or whatever, missing apps off my phone. That's a cost that you're going to have to explain and justify and or find some way to get people to embrace or suffer electoral consequences. Is that brewing still, or am I making this up because I was stunned by my daughter's comments?
No, I agree with you. And I mean, the reporting that I think is in the journal is that the Chinese are seeking Elon Musk as a white knight here.
And there's a role for him there, and there's a role for him
I
in
mean,
that role.
to buy the company.
Oh, I see. I see. To come to save TikTok.
Yeah.
But if it's not TikTok, it's something else, right? Because the Chinese already have a secondary app already in place in the United States. It's already gaining popularity in fear of TikTok going away. And again, it's Chinese run, Chinese owned. So it's when does this cycle ever end? I mean, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, but he can't buy it all.
But you're right. That's a very important kind of question, and one that's going to come. I mean, the Supreme Court is ruling on this momentarily, I believe.
I think it's today. I hope they're getting an announcement today. I think is what I heard. But that's so anyways, that's a piece of the puzzle that actually it creates enormous puzzles in my head. And the other piece of the puzzle too is the tariff piece. What we've already seen since the Trump tariffs were in place in his last administration was not so much. I mean, there have been some increased costs in Chinese goods, but mostly we've just seen shifting supply lines, right? Supply chains have gone now through Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia or other parts of the world that are more friendly to China and then come to the US or because they're US China. So our trade relations with China have gone awry, but not directly. I mean, they're now it's just an indirect path. It's you have to put some middlemen in the middle to clean the goods, if you will, before they arrive in America. A global economy and global supply chains kind of function against an administration trying to exercise that kind of autonomy unless they can get a fairly sizable international community to side with them. Is there a chance, based upon his performance in the last administration, that President Trump will actually work towards some sort of multinational approach to handling China, or is it still going to be mano a mano?
You know, the Trans-Pacific Trade, what was it? Is it
TPP.
TPP? I mean, that was really designed to
Yeah.
Yeah,
do, and they pulled
right,
out. The Trump administration pulled out, I think, within
right.
5 days. And Hillary Clinton had also started dumping on it during a campaign and sort of disassociating herself with it because she saw it as an electoral problem.
Yeah,
But the TPP that
right.
response that you described, Jeff, which was an alliance with up to half a dozen Asian countries, essentially designed to kind of cooperate in a way that constrained China from a trade perspective. And but I it's based on past performance, I think the short answer is no. And the Biden administration, did produce the CHIPS Act, which is sort of it's been very helpful for Arizona. I think Arizona gets 6 billion out of the 53. But that was the right thing to do, which is to bring back chip making to the United States from Taiwan and from China. And I don't see Trump changing that. He may even want to amplify it.
Mm.
I mean, it's oddly in line with the Trump promises, even though it's so clearly a Biden-inspired policy, and kind of an incredible accomplishment when you think about it. To have gotten all that money together, and we see it obviously in Arizona. We see it very concretely
Yeah.
in a way that that it's quite striking how relatively fast. It'll take a while for substantive amounts of chips to all be being made in the U.S., but the process has started. It's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, for those of us who live in the North Valley. seeing the
Yes, yeah.
TSMC fab go up, it's eye-watering the magnitude of that effort that's going on out there in the Northwest Valley.
But isn't the big question, like with that headline you mentioned, look, there's no way to know what we'll be talking about 4 years from now, which is to say at the end of the Trump administration,
Right.
right? There's not going to be another Trump administration. You know, we don't know what will happen. We don't know what crises will appear. But it is interesting to reflect on the first one. I mean, there's certain things that Trump brought into the conversation. I thought, frankly, sort of interestingly, was just how much the U.S. spends on the security of other states. I mean, the tone in the presentation was it's a bad deal, but I think a reckoning with that was sort of healthy intellectually, maybe not in its political manifestation because of the kind of aggressiveness of it. That's
Hmm.
been sort of interesting. And then we think of what policies were promised and how they played out. I mean, the wall was the story of the 2016 election.
Hmm.
And whatever happened to this wall and what did Mexico pay for? It didn't seem to prosper. It didn't seem to significantly affect the Trump story, leaving aside the various scandals associated with it and money spent. But in other words, we just don't really know how profound it will be. It could be quite profound, but there's reason to believe that maybe a lot of this big talk, I mean, this tariff talk, I mean, it's certainly unlikely we're going to see 20% tariffs with Canada.
Yeah.
Possible,
Right.
right? But I mean, it's just so hard to play this thing out and see what's going to happen. It's hard to not be, it's hard to figure out what talk counts for real policy and what real policy, it'll be an interesting time, I'm sure. And I'm sure the things that will end up being the most shocking or change oriented are not what we're hearing now. That's my
Mhm.
Well,
sense.
picking up on that, personnel is policy was a Reagan,
Right.
and I was surprised. I thought when Trump announced that Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. were going to be leading the transition effort, that was kind of a House of Lords job, and he had no intention of giving them any kind of real role. Well, I was completely wrong. And so if you look at the personnel,
Yeah.
if personnel really is policy, changes domestically at HHS, if Kennedy is confirmed, certainly the fact that the deputy chief of staff for policy is Stephen Miller, I think, is very important. A
Yeah.
friend of mine who's quite well informed said, "Well, that's a pretty low-ranking job for." I said, "No, no, no. That is, other than the chief of staff, in fact, arguably, it is the most important job because the chief of staff is basically busy all day, kind of making the traffic work, and you know. But Steve Miller is the chief policymaker of this administration, and it has the job to go with it.
Mm.
And his views on immigration, etc., are well known. So, I while it is true that when Trump says things like 20% tariffs on China, we just don't quite know what that means in practice. But the immigration landscape is going to change
Yeah.
dramatically. I think we can take as
Mhm.
that's going to
Basically.
happen. It's just a
But
question
then,
of time.
Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, assuming he's confirmed, is a different story, right? And Mike Waltz as NSA. Although Tulsi
Yeah, well,
Gabbard, what do you think of Tulsi Gabbard as
Yeah, Tulsi Gabbard's ODNI. Yeah.
ODNI? Yeah.
well, the ODNI can be a House of Lords job. Um,
Yeah.
the job is to oversee the 18 U.S. intelligence agencies. You don't have budgetary authority, so and I think Avril Haines, who did it for Biden, it is a cabinet level job, but it doesn't. The CIA still. I mean, DoD, by the way, has 80% of the intelligence budget, as I'm sure Jeff knows, because they have
Hmm.
NSA, the National Reconnaissance Office, Defense Intelligence Agency. The point is that the ODNI job can really mean nothing. I mean,
Right. They don't.
she does. I think if you're seen as somebody who has the ear of the president and somebody who's relatively competent, I think it's meaningful. But Ratcliffe had a Ratcliffe is gone to CIA, and back in the first administration, he was regarded as radioactive, but now he's seen as sort of somewhat okay. And his nomination, I think, was very unremarkable.
Mm.
So let's see what with Tulsi how I don't think it's the bottom line is, the job doesn't necessarily need to amount to very much.
Yeah.
And I think that Dan Coates, who was ODNI under Trump, he publicly testified that Iran was sticking to the Iran nuclear agreement, which was why he basically lasted, he was forced out. I don't think Tulsi Gabbard will tell the president what he doesn't want to hear, which is precisely the wrong way for any intelligence professional to behave. The whole point of the intelligence professional is to be the skunk at the garden party with the bad news you don't want to hear or what doesn't fit your preconceptions. But that is clearly, if you look at 2025, the project 2025, the idea is to get the intelligence community to tell the president what he wants to hear.
Yeah, that's that actually we were having a discussion some colleagues and I yesterday after a meeting having a conversation about how authoritarian regimes once they've consolidated power end up eventually surrounding themselves only with yes people, right? So their view of the world seems very distorted, which is one of the reasons why a lot of folks think Putin made such a strategic miscalculation with the invasion of Ukraine, because the world he saw was fundamentally different than the world that existed, because that's all he got told. And President Xi is doing largely the same thing in China at some point, which could be a problem. But when you turn it out, when you look at the cabinet appointees for the incoming administration, you wonder, are we not doing the same thing then? Are we not creating a commander in chief, a top executive who's going to be surrounded by people who are not going to be the skunk in the room telling them things they don't want to hear, because
Well,
you're not
I
going to be there
I
long?
mean, you
I
point out a good
completely agree.
metric for evaluating this administration, so we're at the start, which is one of the amazing things about our government at its best is all of these reports and all of these efforts that say very inconvenient things. Think of GAO reports and think of, at their best, these reports actually reveal information that is often incredibly negative as regards US policy or critical or, and fact-based. So it would be a sign of a profound governance failure if 4 years from now, this sort of reporting doesn't function, if these sorts of advice giving are all just yes people, and
I'll
that
give you
would that
another.
would be a
I'll
that
give
would
you
be a sign.
another
And then if
more.
that becomes institutionalized, it's a great
Mhm.
sign.
I'll give you another much more proximate indicator. Well, I mean, Cash Patel being one of them, but
Yeah.
Mhm.
I looked at the Plum Book, which is the official publication of the U.S. government for political jobs. Guess how many political jobs there are at the CIA?
Official ones, probably only a handful, right? Two or three.
Yeah, 4.
Yeah.
And how many at the FBI?
Oh, more. A couple more, but not very many more.
No, 1, I think, at the FBI.
Oh, right. Yeah, even the director. Yeah.
So there was some discussion of Amaryllis Fox being the deputy director of CIA, who was a very junior CIA officer. She's married to RFK Jr.'s son, and that discussion seems to have dissipated. But deputy director of the CIA is a very senior role,
Hmm.
because you're running, you're the operational leader of the organization. So I think a early indicator will be if political appointees are appointed in significant numbers at the intelligence agencies. That would be precisely what you're talking about, Jeff. At the State Department, the number of political appointees has always been much larger. But clearly, we've already seen 3 senior career Foreign Service officers
Great.
told to resign. They're the
Yeah.
people kind of managing the building to a large degree. So, these will be early indicators of where things go.
Another one, and from a guy who wrote a book on Trump and his generals. Let's examine, what I like to call the five-sided puzzle palace, and how they respond to a purge of generals in a maybe not Stalin-esque way, but on a similar vein. If you're of a certain ilk, you are going to be a target for elimination in the least violent way, I hope. What are your thoughts on that? How far can that proceed? I'm fairly familiar with the process, and it strikes me as being particularly difficult, but
Well, but I mean,
they don't seem to think that way.
well, so Pete Hegseth is, on a jihad against General Brown, who's the
Yeah, yeah,
chairman of the Joint Chiefs, also a former an Air Force officer like yourself. Um, they may well get rid of Brown, or they only have to do like two, to encourage the others, as they say in French, pour encourager les autres. You don't have to like get rid of everybody. You just need to make a few public executions, as it were, in a metaphorical sense, and you get the same result. And Hegseth, his whole hearing, which I watched a good chunk of, was about how woke the military is, and he regards General Brown as sort of a DEI obsessed general. I mean, I just read his book, and Brown is a particular target. So I think it's quite likely. I mean, there's nothing, if the commander in chief says, I don't want you to be my chief military advisor,
Right.
which, I mean, you
Yeah.
can say, yes, sir.
Well, that's one, but the target list that was generated several weeks ago, included hundreds of officers
Yeah,
across the services.
but Jeff, I think you get the same result without having to do
Right.
it.
Kill one, scare the rest. That's my dad
Yeah.
always said. But and I'm thinking he was facetious, but I'm not sure. Yeah, good. We have not gotten to any questions, and I don't know if that's a function of the fact that the Q&A block's not working, or if it's just a very interesting conversation by the three of us. But I do appreciate the attendance. A lot of folks came and stuck around for the entire hour. Any parting shots, Daniel and Peter, things that that you think are kind of more important that we just didn't touch on that you want to kind of close us out with, Daniel?
Yeah, so I think one of the more extraordinary things about the last election was the way in which the first Trump administration was remembered. And one of the hard things to conceptualize now is not only what will happen, but how will it be processed and thought about? It would be interesting now to start to try to set some metrics. I thought it was interesting, this point about, who gets certain appointments. That is significant. What will be this impact? I mean, the great fear, I think, is that those things that work pretty well in the government or work well enough will be dismantled and harmed. I mean, the great fear is something even more catastrophic, right? A catastrophic crisis. But it's hard to know from where we stand, which we've seen certain shifts that are really profound, the way in which the kind of basic norms, even these confirmation hearings show that, right? Basic ideas as to what it means to have a certain kind of job, what basic qualifications are, or even just discourse, what's allowed and reasonable when you're talking publicly about your colleagues. So that's been massively affected in this last bunch of years. Its long-term impact's hard to assess. So, parting thoughts. I mean, we don't know which of these actions we'll take. In the same way the wall set the stage for this incredible anger, some of it quite legitimate, about migration and what it means, but also turned out to be a policy that didn't mean a whole lot. Spent some money, but didn't profoundly affect the polity, nor did it accomplish what it said it was going to accomplish. China policy, great example. Trump set a China policy that was in line, frankly, with what became the foreign policy establishment. Hasn't shifted under Biden. So, what are final thoughts? I mean, we hope our country navigates away from the most dangerous possibilities in the next couple of years.
Right, Peter?
The right wing of the Republican Party and the left wing of the Democratic Party basically share the same view of the world, which is kind of a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, we've been here before in American history. It didn't work out the last time. Maybe it'll work out this time.
Your hope's not a great strategy, but when it's the only one you got.
Always cause for hope.
All right. Thank you both very much. I appreciate your time, and thank you all for the attendees for coming. And we have these events. I've got several of them planned throughout the spring. I hope you can join us for the future ones as well. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Jeff.
Bye-bye.
Bye.